The poison passed around the table like wine. I'm not talking about a political assassination, but a social ritual. Because for certain women in the Middle Ages, seeking visions meant flirting with death itself. They deliberately drank flying ointment, a toxic paste of hemlock, nightshade, and belladonna, slathered on their skin or steeped in drink. This wasn't suicide. It was a calculated dance with the grave. They would slip into paralytic, waking dream trances, believing their souls flew to wild Sabbaths. All while their cold, stiffening bodies lay motionless in bed, neighbors whispering that another woman had gone traveling. The line between a mystical experience and a fatal overdose was a thread they chose to walk every time. Hello and welcome. Before you close your eyes and get cozy, make sure to subscribe and like the video, and let me get you to sleep flawlessly. Imagine, for a moment, that your greatest escape, your most thrilling pleasure, requires you to first dance with death. This is not a metaphor. In the shadowed corners of the Middle Ages, far from the sanctioned merriment of feast days and maypoles, certain women sought visions in the most perilous of ways, by deliberately poisoning themselves. They called it flying ointment. The name sounds almost whimsical, belying the dark alchemy of its recipe. This was no simple herbal brew. It was a thick, greasy salve concocted from the most potent and deadly plants in the medieval pharmacopoeia. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, with its berries like dark, tempting jewels. Henbane, known to stir vivid and terrifying dreams. Mandrake, shrouded in shrieking legend. And hemlock, the very poison that killed Socrates. These were not ingredients for healing. They were tools for shattering the boundaries of reality. The application was intimate and insidious. A woman would strip naked in the secrecy of her home and rub the toxic paste onto her skin, often on the thin, sensitive flesh of the wrists, temples, or, most chillingly, onto a staff or broomstick which she would then straddle. The warm, oily unguent allowed the alkaloids to absorb directly into her bloodstream, bypassing the gut to begin their sinister work with terrifying efficiency. What followed was not fun as we understand it. It was a harrowing, out-of-body ordeal. The poisons induced a profound and paralytic trance. Her physical body would grow cold, stiff, and insensible, often collapsing into a death-like state. To an outsider, a neighbor, a husband, a child who stumbled upon her, she might appear comatose or even deceased, but in her mind, she was embarking on a wild, uncontrollable journey. This was the flight. She would believe her soul had left her inert body behind to soar through the night. The sensations described in fragmentary accounts and later witch trial testimonies are a psychedelic horror. A viol. Chapter 1. The Hidden World of Medieval Women's Leisure. When we try to picture the daily life of a woman in the Middle Ages, the images that most readily come to mind are ones of unending toil. We might see a peasant woman bent double in a field, her hands rough from labor, or a noblewoman sitting perfectly still, engaged in the silent, solemn work of embroidery. The record of history, written largely by men and for purposes of account-keeping, law, or theology, reinforces this impression of a life defined by duty. Duty to Lord, to husband, to family, and to God. Fun, it seems, had no official place in this world. But to stop there is to misunderstand the human spirit entirely. Leisure and amusement were not absent. They were simply woven into the fabric of life with a subtler, quieter thread. They existed in the margins, in the spaces between prescribed tasks, and often in forms that would escape the notice of a chronicler or a moralist. The fun of medieval women was rarely a dedicated pursuit in the way we might think of it today. It was less about entertainment and more about respite, less about escape, and more about the transformation of necessity into an opportunity for social connection and personal satisfaction. This hidden world of leisure was shaped and constrained by the twin pillars of a woman's life, her social class and her stage of life. A young noblewoman in a castle chamber had a vastly different landscape of potential amusement than an aging brewer's widow in a bustling town, and both of their experiences were alien to a villain's wife in a rural village. Yet across these divides, common threads emerge. The deep human need for community, for mental stimulation, for storytelling, and for moments of simple, sensory joy. For the vast majority, fun was a communal affair. It was found in the collective rhythm of work turned social. The evening spinning bee, where the tedious task of making thread was transformed by shared gossip, song, and the calm. Chapter 2, Spinning and Socializing, the Spinning Bee. Perhaps the most quintessential, yet most overlooked, form of leisure in a medieval woman's life was the simple act of spinning. In an age where every stitch of clothing, every sheet, every sail began with thread spun by hand, the task was ceaseless. It was a fundamental economic duty, as vital as cooking or farming. Yet, it was within this very obligation that one of the most important social institutions for women was born. The spinning bee, often called a spinning evening or simply, the gathering. After the day's main labors were done, the fields tended, the meals cleared, women would often come together, usually in the largest home of the village or in a communal space. Each would bring her distaff, loaded with flax or wool, and her spindle. There, in the flickering light of a central hearth or a few tallow candles, the real work of the evening would begin. But it was work transformed. The rhythmic, almost meditative actions, pulling the fibers, twisting the spindle, winding the newly formed yarn, created a steady, soothing background hum. This rhythm facilitated conversation, not hindered it. In this space, the strict hierarchies of the daytime could soften. The young maiden might sit beside the wise grandmother. The farmer's wife could share a bench with the smith's daughter. Here, news was exchanged. Not the official news of lords and battles, but the vital news of the community. Whose cow had calved, whose daughter was being courted, whose roof needed repair before the winter storms. Recipes and remedies were shared, whispered from one woman to another, a living library of practical knowledge passed down outside of any formal script. It was also a time for storytelling. Old tales were recited, fragments of folklore, local legends of spirits in the woods, moral fables. These stories, told in the intimate circle of firelight, were how culture was preserved and how values were transmitted to the younger G. Chapter 3, Games of Chance. Dice in the Shadows. While the spinning bee represented a sanctioned communal leisure, there existed another, more shadowy world of amusement, one that pulsed with a quicker, sharper thrill, the world of games of chance, particularly dice. For medieval women, as for men, the rattle of bone cubes on a wooden table or a hard-packed earthen floor was a sound synonymous with risk, excitement, and often, scandal. Dice games were ubiquitous, cutting across class lines. We have evidence from manor court rolls, from clerical sermons, and from literary tales that women were active participants. In the dim corners of taverns, in the kitchens of great houses after the lords had retired, and even in the quiet of the cloister, where it was frequently forbidden, the dice would appear. These were simple games, often just a matter of wagering on a high roll, but their simplicity was the very source of their power. In a world governed by rigid fate, the fate of one's birth, one's marriage, one's station, the dice offered a miniature, manageable universe of pure, chaotic chance. For a brief moment, a servant could beat a merchant's wife, and fortune could smile on anyone. For women, this form of play carried a distinct and dangerous edge. Gambling was vehemently condemned by the church and viewed with suspicion by civic authorities. It was seen as a gateway to idleness, vice, and the loss of domestic order. A woman gambling was, in the eyes of moralists, neglecting her primary duties, her household, her children, her sober demeanor. To be caught was to risk more than just the loss of a few coins. It was a blow to her reputation. Court records from places like medieval London show women, often Brewsters or shopkeepers, being fined for frequenting the dice. Their names entered into the official ledger as disorderly. And yet, they played on. The attraction was multifaceted. At its most basic, it was the visceral thrill of the game itself, the shouted encore. Chapter 4, The Chessboard Queens. Amidst the rustic dice games and the rhythmic toil of the spinning bee, there existed a pursuit of a wholly different character, one that required not luck, but profound intellectual strategy, the game of chess. In the courts and noble households of medieval Europe, chess emerged as a rare and fascinating arena where women were not only permitted to play, but could, for the duration of the game, wield a form of power that mirrored and subtly commented upon the world beyond the checkered board. Chess arrived in Europe via the Islamic world, and with it came a conception of the game as a noble pastime, a training ground for military and political strategy. Yet, as it was adopted and adapted by Christian society, its symbolism evolved. The pieces became reflections of the feudal order: kings, knights, rooks, bishops, and pawns. And then, of course, there was the queen. In the earliest European versions, this piece was relatively weak, often moving only one square diagonally. But over the centuries, her power on the board exploded. By the late Middle Ages, the queen had become the most potent piece, moving any number of squares in any direction. This transformation is one of the great mysteries of the game's history, but it created a powerful, unique space on the board for a feminine force of unparalleled scope. For a noblewoman, proficiency at chess was a mark of cultivation and intellect. It was a socially acceptable way to engage in deep, focused thought and competitive play. Manuscript illustrations often show mixed-gender pairs engaged in a game, suggesting it was a legitimate form of courtly interaction between men and women. To play was to participate in a microcosm of warfare and statecraft, domains from which women were almost entirely excluded in reality. On the 64 squares, however, a woman could marshal armies, orchestrate complex attacks, lay cunning traps, and deliver a decisive checkmate. Her mind was the general. Chapter 5. Embroidery Circles. Art and Conversation. If the chessboard was a silent theater of intellect, the embroidery circle was its vibrant, tactile counterpart, a world of color, texture, and murmured conversation. For women of the nobility and the prosperous merchant classes, the practice of embroidery was far more than a decorative craft or a mere display of feminine virtue. Within the intimate, often sunlit space of a bower or a great hall window, the collective act of sewing transformed needlework into one of the most sophisticated and socially rich forms of leisure. The materials themselves spoke of privilege and purpose. Costly silks and threads imported from distant lands, precious metals spun into gleaming filament, linen grounds of the finest weave. The projects were often grand in scale and ambition, vast narrative tapestries depicting hunts or biblical scenes, exquisite ecclesiastical vestments for the local church, or heraldic garments that proclaimed family lineage. This work was slow, demanding immense patience and a keen artistic eye. It was, in every sense, a serious undertaking. Yet, within this seriousness, lay the space for profound enjoyment and camaraderie. Embroidery was typically a shared endeavor. A mistress of a household would often work alongside her daughters, her ladies-in-waiting, and other female members of the domestic sphere. As hands moved in practiced rhythm, piercing the cloth and pulling the thread through, a parallel stream of dialogue flowed. This was the setting for the most trusted confidences and the most nuanced social navigation. Here, marriages were discussed, alliances weighed, and the complex politics of the court dissected in hushed tones. The steady, familiar motion of the needle seemed to loosen tongues and encourage a candor less possible in more formal settings. The work also fostered a deep, communal pride and a sense of shared legacy. A large tapestry might take years to complete, becoming a chronicle of th. Chapter 6. The Falcon on Her Wrist. Women in Falconry. Beyond the walls of chambers and the confines of gardens, a more exhilarating form of leisure awaited the medieval noblewoman, one that connected her to the raw vitality of the natural world and the prestigious theater of the hunt. This was the art of falconry, the only form of hunting considered not only appropriate for a high-born lady, but a mark of her nobility and discernment. While the boar hunt with its spears and clamor was the domain of men, the falcon hunt was a subtler, more refined pursuit, and it offered women a unique sphere of active outdoor agency. The bird itself was a symbol of immense status. Falcons, particularly the smaller, more manageable species like the merlin or the graceful peregrine, were luxury items of the highest order. They were captured from wild eyries in distant lands, traded across continents, and required an army of skilled falconers to train and maintain. For a woman to possess one, and more importantly, to handle it herself, was a vivid display of her family's wealth and her own personal refinement. The equipment was equally ornate. The leather glove, often embroidered, the tiny hoods and jesses, the bells attached to the bird's legs whose sound was both practical and poetic, a tinkling music across the fields. The pursuit itself was a form of leisure that blended patience, strategy, and sudden, thrilling action. A day's hawking meant riding out into the open country, the bird perched regally on her raised, protected fist. The goal was not the direct, bloody confrontation of other hunts, but a partnership with a wild creature. The woman would release the falcon to soar into the sky, a powerful extension of her own will. Her role was to flush the quarry, a heron, a duck, a hare, from the brush, setting the stage for the falcon's breathtaking, stooping dive from hundreds of feet in the air. The kill was swift, observed from a distance, and the success belonged as much to the Chapter 7, Festival Days and Public Merriment. Beyond the private circles and noble pursuits, the rhythm of a medieval woman's year was punctuated by the vibrant, collective explosions of fun provided by public festivals and feast days. These were not mere holidays. They were essential safety valves for societal pressure, sanctioned periods where the normal rules of conduct relaxed, and the entire community, men, women, and children, came together in a shared atmosphere of revelry. For women, whose movements and behaviors were often closely watched, these days offered a legitimate and vital taste of freedom, spectacle, and uninhibited joy. The liturgical calendar provided the framework. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the myriad feast days of saints. Each came with its own traditions. There was the Feast of Fools, a brief, topsy-turvy world where lowly clergy could parody their superiors, and ordinary silliness was encouraged. There was May Day, with its dancing around the maypole, a potent symbol of fertility and renewal where young women, adorned with flowers, could lead the dances and partake in games that often blurred the lines of formal courtship. For a day, the strict hierarchies softened. A peasant woman could stand beside the wife of a guildsman, both craning their necks to see the same mystery play performed on a wagon in the town square. These plays were a cornerstone of festival entertainment. Staging biblical stories from the creation to the Last Judgment, they were community theater on a grand scale. For women in the audience, this was immersive storytelling. They would witness the folly of Noah's wife, the grief of the Virgin Mary, the terror of the damned souls, experiencing a full spectrum of emotion in public. It was theology made visceral, a shared emotional journey that was both entertainment and instruction. The laughter at the comic devil, the gasps at special effects like fake blood or Hell's Mouth, created a powerful communal bond. Then the Chapter 8, Songs by the Hearth, Music in the Home. The medieval soundscape was not one of silence, but of ambient human creation, and within the home, the most constant and personal music was that made by women's voices and hands. Formal, composed music existed in the courts and churches, performed by professional minstrels and choirs of men and boys. But the daily, domestic soundtrack of life, the true background score of women's world, was a more intimate, fluid, and versatile art. This was the realm of song by the hearth, a form of leisure woven seamlessly into the tasks of the day and the quiet of the evening. This music required no special stage, no audience of nobles. Its primary instrument was the voice. Women sang while they worked, rhythmic weaving songs to keep the shuttle's pace, slow, melodic lullabies to soothe a child, repetitive chants for grinding grain or churning butter. The work song transformed labor from a solitary burden into a measured, almost ritualistic act. The melody gave a tempo to the hands, and the lyrics, often simple and repetitive, allowed the mind a gentle focus or a pleasant wandering. This was functional music, but in its functionality, it carved out a space for personal expression and emotional release. A sorrowful ballad sung while mending could be a private catharsis. A lively tune hummed while baking could lift the spirits of the entire kitchen. Beyond the voice, women were often the players of portable, domestic instruments. The harp, particularly the smaller Irish or Gothic harp, was an instrument associated with gentle nobility and storytelling, suitable for a lady's chamber. The lute, with its soft, intricate tones, was another favorite. But more common were humble instruments like the flute or recorder, the psaltery, a plucked string instrument, or simply a tambourine or small drum for rhythm. Girls in well-to-do households were often taught music as part of their upbringing, a skill that demonstrated refinement and cowl. Chapter 9. The Courtly Love Tradition, a Noble Distraction. For women of the highest nobility, particularly those in the vibrant, often stifling atmosphere of the royal or princely courts, a unique and complex form of intellectual and emotional leisure evolved. Their role as the focal point of the courtly love tradition. This was not a simple amusement, but a highly ritualized, socially sanctioned game of wit, longing, and poetic expression that transformed the experience of aristocratic women from mere political assets into idealized muses and arbiters of a new kind of cultural value. The rules of this game were elaborate and often contradictory. A knight or a troubadour would pledge his eternal, devoted, and almost always hopeless love to a lady, often one of higher status, and almost certainly married to another man. This love was meant to be chaste, a source of spiritual and moral improvement for the lover. His devotion would be expressed through deeds of valor, performed in her name in tournaments or battles, and, more accessibly within the court, through the composition and performance of poetry and song. The lady's role was to listen, to judge, to offer occasional tokens of favor, a sleeve, a ribbon, and to maintain a delicate balance between inspiration and unattainability. For the lady at the center of this attention, the tradition offered a potent form of diversion and indirect power. In a life where her marriage was a treaty and her body a vessel for lineage, courtly love provided a separate, fantasy realm where she was adored for her personal qualities, her beauty, her grace, her worth, rather than her lands or bloodline. Listening to a beautifully composed canso love song, in the Occitan tongue or a chivalric romance read aloud in the chamber was a deeply engaging leisure activity. It was an emotional and aesthetic experience, a form of collective storytelling where she was not just an audience member, but the implicit heroine. This tradition also Chapter 10. The Quiet Joy of Herb Gardens. Outside the castle's stone walls and beyond the crowded market square, there existed a realm of leisure defined not by sound, but by scent, texture, and patient, watchful care. This was the herb garden, a small, ordered domain where medieval women of many stations, from the lady of the manor to the wife of a prosperous villain, found a profound and multifaceted form of quiet pleasure. More than a simple pantry, the garden was a sanctuary, an apothecary, and a canvas, offering a deeply satisfying pastime rooted in nurturing, knowledge, and sensual delight. Tending a garden was, first and foremost, a sanctioned and respectable activity. It aligned perfectly with the domestic and healing roles ascribed to women. The lady might oversee a larger, formal hortus conclusus enclosed garden, with raised beds and decorative knots, while a countrywoman might cultivate a humble plot by her cottage door. In both, the rhythms were the same. The planting of seeds, the careful weeding, the mindful watering, the patient waiting for green shoots to break the earth. This work had a clear, virtuous purpose, to provide flavor for food, remedies for illness, strewing herbs for floors, and fragrance for linens. Yet, within that purpose lay immense space for personal satisfaction. The garden was a place of sensory respite. To walk its paths was to be enveloped in a tapestry of aromas. The sharpness of sage, the sweetness of chamomile, the pungency of rosemary, the coolness of mint. To run one's fingers through the feathery leaves of dill or the velvety softness of lamb's ear was a tactile pleasure. After the noise and smells of the household or the fields, the garden offered a haven of comparative quiet and controlled, living beauty. It was a place one could go to be alone with one's thoughts, the simple, repetitive tasks of pruning and pinching back allowing the mind to rest or wander freely. This leisure was also deeply intellectual. The success. Chapter 11. From Hymn to Ballad, Women's Voices in Song. The chapter explores music's dual role in medieval women's lives, from the sacred halls of convents to the secular intimacy of the home. It describes the intellectual and spiritual fulfillment of complex liturgical music in religious communities, where women mastered notation and polyphony to elevate divine worship. This contrasts with the fluid, oral tradition of folk ballads in the outside world, where women were the primary transmitters of stories through song. These ballads carried news, folklore, and moral lessons, offering a legitimate public voice and emotional catharsis. Whether chanting psalms or singing of tragic love, A woman's voice was a powerful tool for connection, memory, and expressing the full spectrum of human experience, blending sacred duty with profound personal and communal release. Chapter 12, The Market Square as Social Hub. This chapter moves to the bustling heart of medieval towns. For women, particularly the wives and daughters of merchants and craftsmen, the market square was far more than a place of commerce. It was a vibrant theater of social interaction and leisure. The piece details the sensory overload of market day, the cries of vendors, the colors of fabrics, the smells of spices and livestock. It explains how women used necessary errands as opportunities for socializing, exchanging gossip while inspecting produce, meeting friends by the cloth seller's stall, or hearing the latest news from travelers. The market was also a place of spectacle, where one might watch a public proclamation, a punishment, or a traveling performer. It served as a crucial venue for maintaining social networks, negotiating reputations, and enjoying the freedom of anonymous observation within a crowd, turning the chore of shopping into a dynamic and engaging social event. Chapter 13. Pilgrimage, Journey, and Fellowship. Here, the focus shifts to a form of leisure that was also a profound spiritual one. Chapter 16. Gambling, Rules, and Reprimands. A pair of dice, tumbling across a worn wooden table, held a unique and dangerous magic in the medieval world. For women, the act of gambling represented a fascinating and fraught frontier of leisure, a thrilling clash of chance, defiance, and social consequence. This chapter does not focus on the simple act of play, but on the intricate dance around it. The unspoken rules, the fierce attractions, and the inevitable reprimands that framed this particular vice. The attraction was primal. In a life governed by the rigid, preordained rules of birth, marriage, and faith, the dice introduced a universe of pure, chaotic possibility. With a lucky roll, a servant could outplay a merchant's wife. A few stolen moments with a hidden cup and knucklebones could turn a dreary afternoon into one of breathless suspense. The coins or trinkets wagered were often of little material consequence. The true currency was the momentary illusion of control over fortune itself. For women whose economic agency was severely limited, this personal secret stake, this tiny kingdom of risk where their choice and luck alone determined the outcome, was a potent psychological escape. But this escape was conducted in the shadows for a reason. The reprimands were swift, severe, and multifaceted. The Church condemned gambling as a sin that bred idleness, avarice, and discord, vices considered especially destructive to the female virtue of sober domesticity. Secular authorities viewed it as a threat to public order, a catalyst for brawls and the impoverishment of households. Manor court rolls are littered with fines levied against women, often identified as Brewsters, spinsters, or simply the wife of John at Gate, for being common players at dice or frequenters of the tavern for gaming. The punishment was a public shaming, a financial penalty, and an indelible mark on one's local reputation. Thus, a complex set of informal rules grew around the prac. Chapter 17. Tending Livestock, Tending Community. For the majority of medieval women, those bound to the land of a village manor, the concept of fun was often inseparable from the shared rhythm of agrarian life. While tending livestock was arduous, essential labor, it also created unexpected arenas for socialization, gentle competition, and a deep, nourishing sense of purpose that transcended mere toil. The care of animals, often a woman's specific domain for creatures like poultry, dairy cows, goats, and geese, wove her into the living fabric of the community in ways that provided a quiet, enduring satisfaction. The day might begin at dawn in the smoky, warm dimness of the byre. Milking was a repetitive, intimate task, a time of quiet communion with the animal. The rhythmic sound of milk striking the pail was a private meditation, but it was also a prelude to a social event. Once the milking was done, the real communal work began. The village herdsman, often a youth or an older man, would make his rounds, collecting the cows from each cottage to drive them to the common pasture. This moment at the gate was a daily touchpoint. Women would emerge, leading their family's cow, exchanging a few words about the weather, a child's fever, or the Lord's new decree. It was a fleeting but vital chance for news and connection before the day's isolation began. For geese and poultry, a woman's management was a source of personal pride and minor economic autonomy. The eggs she collected, the feathers she plucked for bedding, the occasional chickens sold at market, these were her province. Success here required skill and knowledge. Knowing which hen was broody, how to protect chicks from foxes, the best scraps for fattening a goose for Michaelmas. This expertise was a form of respected intelligence. In the shared space of the common green where ducks waddled, women might compare their flocks, offering advice or sympathizing over losses, their conversation punctuated by clucks and Chapter 18. The Inn and Tavern, Women's Presence. The medieval inn or tavern is often imagined as a masculine domain, a place of boisterous merchants, rowdy travelers, and local men drinking ale. This picture, however, obscures a more nuanced reality. For women, these establishments were not forbidden spaces but complex social hubs where they participated, worked, and found amusement in roles that ranged from proprietress to patron. The tavern offered a unique, liminal space for female leisure that existed outside the direct supervision of home and church. Many taverns and inns were, in fact, run by women. Widows, in particular, often inherited or took over such businesses, which were considered a respectable extension of domestic skill. The brewster, the female brewer, was a common figure, as ale brewing was traditionally women's work. For these women, the tavern was their workplace, but it was also their social center. Managing the establishment meant constant interaction with the community, wielding economic authority, and cultivating a reputation for good ale and a welcoming hearth. The fun for them was in the sociability of the trade, the buzz of conversation, and the power that came from being the keeper of a vital communal resource. For women who were patrons, the tavern offered a sanctioned reason to gather. It was acceptable for women to enter, often in small groups, to fetch the household's daily or weekly supply of ale, the penny pot. This errand, however, rarely ended with a swift purchase. It was an opportunity to linger, to catch up on news brought by carters and pilgrims, to hear a wandering musician, or simply to enjoy a drink in the company of other women before returning to domestic isolation. In the dim, smoky warmth, the rules of conduct softened slightly. Seated together on a bench, they could speak more freely, sharing confidences that might be overheard but were cushioned by the general murmur of the room. The tavern also served as a stage FO. Chapter 19, Board Games, Merrills and Tables. While dice promised the quick thrill of chance, another form of indoor leisure offered a slower, more cerebral satisfaction. The world of board games. In the quiet corners of Solar, Cottage, and Cloister, women engaged in games of strategy that were as much about companionship and mental exercise as they were about competition. Two games, in particular, dominated the medieval interior: Merrills, or Nine Men's Morris, and Tables, the ancestor of backgammon. These were the quiet battles of the hearth, fought with wooden pieces on incised boards. Merrills was a game of pure strategy, often scratched onto a slab of stone, a wooden table, or even into the back of a pew. Two players, each with 9 pieces, would take turns placing them on the intersections of a grid, aiming to form a straight line of 3, a mill. Forming a mill allowed a player to remove one of her opponent's pieces. The game required foresight, spatial reasoning, and a patient, trapping mind. Its beauty lay in its silent depth. A game of Merrills could last a long time, a perfect accompaniment to an afternoon of conversation or a quiet evening by the fire. For women, it was a legitimate way to engage in a contest of wits, one where experience and cleverness could triumph regardless of the player's status. Tables, on the other hand, introduced the element of dice to the board. Players moved their pieces around a board based on the roll of dice, aiming to be the first to bear them all off. It was a hybrid of strategy and fortune, demanding both calculated risk and adaptive tactics. The rattle of the dice in the wooden cup and the sharp click of the pieces on the board created a familiar, comforting soundscape. Table sets could be simple or elaborate, with some owned by wealthy households being beautifully crafted from ivory or inlaid wood. Playing tables was a social, often noisy affair, filled with the groans of bad luck and the triumph of a well-executed bee. Chapter 20. The Solace of Devotional Reading. For a small but significant minority of medieval women, the deepest and most profound leisure was found not in a game or a gathering, but in the silent, sacred space of a book. In a world where literacy was a rare key, the ability to read, particularly devotional texts, opened a door to a rich interior world of contemplation, intellectual engagement, and personal piety that was both a solemn duty and a supreme pleasure. This was a leisure of the soul and the mind, a retreat into a realm of words that offered solace, instruction, and a powerful sense of connection to the divine. The primary text for such women was the Book of Hours, a personalized prayer book that was often the most precious object a noblewoman or wealthy burgher's wife owned. Lavishly illuminated with brilliant miniatures depicting saints, biblical scenes, and the Virgin Mary, these books were artworks in themselves. The act of reading them was multisensory, tracing the elegant script with a finger, absorbing the vivid colors of the illustrations, and murmuring the psalms and prayers for the canonical hours. This was not a hurried act, but a meditative ritual. A woman might retire to a window seat or a private chapel, turning the vellum pages as the light shifted, using the text to structure her private devotions and guide her thoughts. The beauty of the object elevated the experience from mere reading to a form of aesthetic and spiritual communion. For women in religious orders, reading was a central pillar of life. In the scriptorium of a convent, nuns not only read but copied and sometimes even illuminated manuscripts. This work, or et labora, prayer and work, in its purest form, was a deeply satisfying intellectual and artistic pursuit. It required linguistic skill, artistic talent, and tremendous patience, offering a sense of purpose and a tangible, beautiful product from one's labor. To read the works of church fathers, saints' lives, or mystical. Chapter 21. Dancing on Feast Days. If devotional reading was a leisure of the inner, silent self, then dancing was its vibrant, physical opposite, a celebration of the body, the community, and the sheer joy of rhythmic movement. For medieval women, dancing was not a casual pastime but a potent, seasonal release, tightly woven into the fabric of religious and agricultural festivals. On feast days, the ordinary rules of conduct and posture softened, and the village green or castle hall transformed into a stage for this most ancient and social of arts. The dances themselves were almost always communal and circular. The carol, a popular form, was a ring dance where participants joined hands, moving in a circle to the left while singing the refrain of a song, with a leader singing the verses. This structure was deeply inclusive. Anyone could join the circle, from the youngest girl to the oldest grandmother. The steps were simple, a sidestep, a skip, a gentle pivot, allowing for conversation, laughter, and eye contact within the turning ring. For women, this was a powerful expression of belonging. Linked hand in hand with their neighbors, they were physically and symbolically united, a living chain of community. These dances were more than mere fun. They were symbolic acts tied to the cycles of nature and the liturgical year. The dances of May Day, around a flower-bedecked maypole, celebrated fertility and the return of spring. The steps were believed by some to encourage the growth of crops, making the women participants in a vital, magical rite to ensure the community's survival. At midwinter or during the 12 days of Christmas, dances provided warmth and merriment against the bleakness of the season, a defiant celebration of life in the face of darkness. For young women especially, the dance was a crucial, sanctioned arena for courtship. It was one of the few places where they could publicly interact with young men in a spirited, yet socially supervised, setting. Chapter 22. The Whirl of Seasonal Celebrations. The medieval year was not a monotonous march of labor, but a wheel that turned through a series of vividly punctuated, seasonal peaks. For women, these celebrations, rooted in the church calendar, ancient agricultural rites, and communal tradition, provided the most anticipated and expansive framework for fun. Each season offered its own distinct flavor of release, ritual, and role, transforming the passage of time into a cycle of recurring joy. The year often began in earnest with the revels of Twelfth Night in January, the culmination of the Christmas season. In great households, this was a time of the Lord of Misrule and feasting, but for women of all classes, It meant a final, glorious burst of winter conviviality. There might be mumming plays, special spiced cakes, and the choosing of a bean king and queen for the evening, a playful inversion of hierarchy where a servant might be crowned. For a night, the ordinary social order was theatrically upended in harmless, laughter-filled ways. As the ground thawed, Easter arrived with its profound mix of somber reflection and explosive celebration. For women, the Lenten fast of the preceding weeks made the Easter feast a sensory triumph. The preparation itself was a leisure of anticipation. Baking sweet, saffron-colored Easter breads, decorating eggs with symbolic designs, and preparing the special Easter cheese. The day itself meant donning one's best clothes, perhaps a new gown or kirtle, and attending the dramatic Easter Mass before partaking in a feast where meat, eggs, and dairy returned to the table with glorious abundance. Then came May Day, perhaps the most iconic of all. For women, this was a celebration inherently tied to youth, fertility, and feminine agency. They would rise at dawn to gather flowers and green branches to decorate homes and to weave into garlands. The central event was the raising of the maypole, a potent symbol, and the dancing that fo. Chapter 24. Crafting tapestries of tale and thread. Beyond the functional embroidery of garments and linens lay the grand, ambitious world of tapestry weaving. For noble and wealthy urban women, the commissioning, designing, and often direct participation in the creation of a large tapestry was arguably the pinnacle of artistic and narrative leisure. This was not a mere pastime. It was a legacy project, an immense undertaking that could occupy years, even decades, and serve as a lasting testament to a woman's piety, taste, and cultural authority. A tapestry was more than a wall hanging. It was a form of monumental storytelling, insulation against castle drafts, and a mobile assertion of identity. Women were frequently the patrons behind these costly works. They would collaborate with master weavers, often from renowned centers like Arras or Tournai, to dictate the subject matter. Popular themes spoke directly to feminine spheres of influence and interest. The Lady and the Unicorn series, with its rich allegories of the senses, scenes from romances like Tristan and Isolde, or devotional series depicting the lives of female saints or the Virgin Mary. In choosing the narrative, a patroness was curating the stories that would surround her family daily, embedding her own values and aspirations into the very fabric of her home. The design process itself was a profound intellectual leisure. Women would work from illuminated manuscripts or consult with artists to create the elaborate cartoons, the full-scale paper designs that weavers followed. This required a keen eye for composition, color theory, and symbolic detail. Deciding how to depict a forest, how to arrange figures in a hunt scene, or which flowers to include in a millefleur's background were acts of creative direction. For a literate and cultured woman, overseeing a tapestry's design was akin to directing a sprawling, silent epic in wool and silk, while the actual weaving on a heavy loom was typically done by pro. Chapter 23. Baking for pleasure, not just necessity. Baking bread was an unyielding, daily necessity in the medieval world, a chore so fundamental it was etched into the rhythm of every household. The coarse, dark loaves that formed the staple of the diet were products of relentless labor, grinding, sifting, kneading, and tending the hearth or communal oven. Yet, within this landscape of necessity, there existed a parallel, more celebratory realm of baking that offered women a creative and deeply satisfying form of leisure. This was the art of baking for pleasure, for festivity, and for personal expression, transforming flour and fire into objects of delight. This pleasurable baking was reserved for feast days, special occasions, and moments of deliberate hospitality. The ingredients themselves marked it as an extraordinary event. Precious white flour, often sifted multiple times to achieve a fine purity. Expensive spices like saffron, ginger, and cinnamon. Dried fruits such as raisins, currants, and figs, and the profound luxury of sugar or honey in generous quantities. To assemble these ingredients was an act of household pride and a tangible investment in joy. The most iconic of these special creations was the subtlety or sautelty, an elaborate, sculpted confection served at the end of a grand feast in noble households. While master cooks might create grand castles or scenes from romances, women, especially in more modest settings, excelled at creating smaller, intricate baked goods. They might fashion gingerbread into shapes of flowers, animals, or even knights and ladies, using wooden molds to imprint intricate designs. These were not merely food. They were edible sculptures, conversation pieces that displayed the baker's skill and artistic flair. For annual festivals, the baking took on ritual significance. At Easter, women baked enriched, sweet breads, often braided and glazed, sometimes with whole, dyed eggs nestled into the dough. For Twelfth Night, the key. Chapter 25. The secret language of flowers and herbs. In the walled garden or the wild hedgerow, medieval women cultivated and collected more than mere ingredients. They engaged with a living, symbolic lexicon. The knowledge of herbs and flowers was a serious, practical science vital to health and household management. Yet, intertwined with this practicality was a subtler, more playful form of leisure, the understanding and use of the secret language of plants. This was a world where every bloom and leaf could carry a double meaning: a message, a warning, a charm, or a silent expression of emotion, understood by women across the social spectrum. This language was rooted in centuries of folklore, classical tradition, and Christian symbolism, passed down through generations of mothers, healers, and nuns. A woman planting a garden or gathering from the meadow was not just stocking her pantry. She was composing a living text. Rosemary, for instance, was for remembrance, a token of fidelity between lovers and a herb strewn on graves. To give rosemary was to make a promise. Rue, with its bitter scent and protective qualities, was herb of grace, used in church aspergillums and believed to ward off evil. It symbolized purification and repentance. Violets represented humility and faithfulness, their modest blue heads nodding in shadowed places. Lavender denoted purity, cleanliness, and calm. This knowledge empowered women in nuanced social and emotional ways. A young woman might tuck a sprig of thyme, symbolizing courage, into a favor for a knight departing for a tournament, or weave daisies, for innocence and loyal love, into a chaplet for a suitor she favored. A subtle, withering message could be sent with a gift of wormwood, denoting absence or bitter sorrow. In the Millefleur's Thousand Flowers, backgrounds of tapestries patronized by noblewomen, this symbolism was frozen in thread: every columbine, for folly; every strawberry, for perfection and righteousness. Eve. Chapter 26. Courting Rituals and Simple Gifts. For the medieval maiden, the path to marriage was rarely a private affair of the heart, but a carefully observed social process. Yet, within the strict frameworks of family alliance and economic negotiation, there existed a cherished space for playful, personal interaction: the rituals of courtship. This delicate dance, often conducted in the semi-public eye of the community, provided young women with a thrilling, sanctioned form of leisure that blended hope, strategy, and the sweet tension of romantic possibility. The settings for these rituals were the very same spaces of communal leisure: feast day dances, church porch gatherings after Mass, May Day celebrations, and the watchful but permissive environment of the spinning bee. Here, under the guise of social participation, a young woman could interact with potential suitors. The dance, as discussed, was a primary arena. Her skill and grace were on display, and the choice of a partner, even for a single round, could send a meaningful signal. A dropped glance, a shared smile within the circle, a brief, whispered exchange as hands linked and parted. These were the fleeting, charged moments that fueled speculation and daydreams. Beyond the dance, the exchange of simple, symbolic gifts was a central and deeply romanticized practice. These were not jewels or lands, but small, handmade tokens whose value lay entirely in their intention. A young woman might give a favor, a sleeve, a ribbon, or a hand-embroidered belt, to a knight before a tournament. This act publicly marked her as his inspiration, binding his performance to her name in a chivalric game of honor. For less exalted suitors, the gifts were humbler but no less significant. A carefully embroidered lace tag for his points, the strings that held his hose doublet together, a hand-knitted coif, close-fitting cap, or a nosegay of herbs and flowers, each bloom chosen for its meaning from the secret language of the Gar. Chapter 27. The Linen Folds, Sewing and Social Bonds. If the grand tapestry was the epic poem of female leisure, then the daily, domestic work of sewing, the mending, hemming, and constructing of garments and household linens, was its steady, humble prose. This was an inescapable duty in an age before ready-made clothing, a task that consumed countless hours. Yet, within this realm of necessity, women once again carved out a space for companionship, creativity, and quiet satisfaction, transforming solitary stitching into a social and often pleasurable ritual known as the sewing circle or, more simply, the work. The setting was typically the solar in a well-to-do household, or the main room of a cottage. Women of the household, the lady, her daughters, her gentlewomen, and often trusted senior servants, would gather with their work baskets. The tasks varied by season and need. Fine embroidery on a shift or chemise, the tedious but vital darning of hose and socks, the hemming of sheets, the cutting and stitching of a new tunic for a child. The materials, from coarse linen for everyday wear to soft lawn and even silk for the wealthy, spoke of status, but the social rhythm of the work crossed class lines. This gathering was a powerhouse of practical knowledge transfer. A young girl learning her stitches under her mother's eye was receiving an education as vital as any boy's lessons in arms. She learned how to reinforce a seam for durability, how to invisibly mend a tear, how to pleat a sleeve for elegance and ease of movement. This was technical knowledge passed from hand to hand and eye to eye, a living curriculum of domestic management. But the true leisure, the fun, was in the concurrent stream of conversation. The steady, rhythmic motion of the needle, pulling the thread through the cloth, the slight tug to tighten the stitch, created a hypnotic, peaceful cadence that encouraged talk. Here, in this trusted feminine space, the talk could be more intimate, more candy. Chapter 28. Watching the mystery plays. For the medieval woman, whose world was often bounded by the walls of home, field, and church, the arrival of the mystery play cycle in the town square was an event of unparalleled scale and spectacle. This was not a passive leisure activity, but an immersive, communal, and deeply emotional experience that combined pious instruction with the thrilling entertainment of grand theater. On a feast day, the entire community would gather, and for a few hours, the ordinary world was suspended, replaced by a vivid, moving panorama of cosmic history, from the creation to the Last Judgment. The plays were organized and performed by the town's guilds, each taking on a biblical episode suited to their trade. The shipwrights building Noah's Ark, the goldsmiths crafting the gifts of the Magi, the bakers preparing the Last Supper. The performances did not happen on a single stage, but on movable pageant wagons that rolled through the streets, stopping at designated stations. A woman in the crowd might witness the Garden of Eden at one corner, the slaughter of the innocents at the next, and the harrowing of hell a street over. She was not an audience member in a fixed seat, but a participant in a flowing urban pilgrimage of drama. For women, the plays offered a unique and sanctioned outlet for powerful emotions. The stories were foundational to their faith, but here they were rendered flesh and blood. They could weep openly and without shame at the lament of the Virgin Mary at the foot of the cross, a scene that profoundly resonated with maternal grief and piety. They could feel righteous anger at the villainous torturers in the Passion plays. They could laugh uproariously at the comic, earthy character of Noah's wife, who beat her husband with her distaff before boarding the ark. A recognizable, scolding matron who brought the divine story down to a human, familiar level. This leisure was also profoundly social and integrative. Standing in. Chapter 29. The gentle sport of hawking. Beyond the tumult of the tournament and the rough chase of the stag hunt, there existed a more refined and accessible outdoor pursuit for the medieval noblewoman, hawking or falconry. This was not merely a pastime, but a revered art, a gentle sport that combined patience, strategy, and a profound partnership with nature. For a woman, it offered a unique form of leisure that was both physically active and intensely cerebral, a sanctioned way to engage with the wild while displaying her nobility and discernment. The sport began with the bird itself, a living emblem of status. The type of raptor one carried was dictated by strict social hierarchy. A queen might fly a majestic gerfalcon. An empress, according to some handbooks, An eagle. A noblewoman most commonly flew the elegant peregrine falcon or the smaller, swift merlin. These birds were not pets, but athletes and partners, their value immense. They were captured from wild eyries, traded across Europe, and required an entourage of skilled falconers to train and care for them. For a lady to have her own bird, and more importantly, the knowledge to handle it, signified her family's wealth and her own cultured expertise. The pursuit was a ritual of serene anticipation. A hawking party would ride out to open countryside, marshes for herons, meadows for larks, woods for smaller game. The lady would wear a thick, often beautifully embroidered gauntlet on her left hand, where the bird would perch, its talons gripping the sturdy leather. The bird would be hooded, a state of calm darkness, until the moment of release. The leisure was in the quiet camaraderie of the ride, the keen observation of the landscape, and the shared, focused silence as the dogs flushed prey from the brush. Then came the thrilling climax. At the right moment, the hood was removed. The falcon, seeing the target, was cast off from the fist. It would climb in towering spirals, a speck against the sky before. Chapter 31. Child's Play, Games with the Young. For medieval women, the care of children was a constant, encompassing reality. Yet, within this duty, there existed a natural and joyful intersection of work and leisure, the act of playing with the young. This was not a separate, scheduled activity, but a fluid part of daily life, where women found amusement in guiding and sharing in the simple games of childhood, rediscovering through their charges the universal language of play. The games themselves were echoes of the adult world, scaled down and stripped of consequence. Little girls were given dolls, often simple cloth or wooden figures, with which they would mimic the maternal and domestic tasks they observed. A mother or older sister might sit with a child, helping to stitch a tiny garment for the doll, transforming a lesson in sewing into a shared, creative game. For boys, there were wooden hobby horses, tops spun with a whip, and miniature wooden swords, allowing them to emulate the knights and soldiers of their father's world. A woman might watch, correct, or even playfully engage in these mock battles, her laughter softening the edges of martial imitation. There were games of pure, active fun that required little. A mother in the cottage yard or a nurse in a castle garden might organize a game of hide and seek among the bushes or behind the laundry. Blind Man's Buff was a universal favorite, its squeals of laughter echoing off stone walls or through sun-dappled orchards. The singing of nursery rhymes and counting out rhymes, many of which have survived for centuries, was a way to soothe, teach, and entertain simultaneously. Clapping games like pat-a-cake provided tactile, rhythmic fun that also developed a child's coordination. For the noblewoman, playtime was often mediated through servants like nurses and governesses, but she was still a central figure in the leisure of her children, especially in the evenings or on feast days. She might tell them story. Chapter 32. The Warmth of the Communal Oven. In many medieval villages, the heart of domestic warmth and weekly social ritual was not just the hearth inside the home, but the communal, wood-fired bread oven. Often a substantial stone or brick structure with a domed roof, it stood as a shared resource and a powerful social magnet. For women, the weekly journey to bake the family's bread was a chore transformed by necessity into a vibrant, gossip-filled, and deeply satisfying form of leisure and community bonding. The process began at home, where each housewife would have prepared her dough from the family's grain, milled at the Lord's mill. The loaves, shaped and marked with a distinctive cut or symbol to identify them, would be carried on a wooden peel or in a basket. On baking day, the area around the oven became a bustling, open-air forum. While waiting for the oven to reach the perfect temperature, often judged by an experienced, often older woman, the queue of women became a captive audience for the exchange of news. This was the village's live wire of information. Here, a woman would learn whose cow had calved, whose son was courting a girl from the next village, what the steward had said about the upcoming harvest, or the latest edict from the manor court. It was a space for troubleshooting. A young bride might seek advice from her elders on why her dough wouldn't rise. A mother might trade remedies for a child's cough. The shared, focused task of providing a fundamental staple created a powerful sense of collective endeavor and mutual dependence. The baking itself was a spectacle of skill and shared labor. The oven tender, sometimes a designated village official, would use a long-handled peel to skillfully slide the loaves into the scorching hot interior. Watching the process, judging the color of the crust through the small oven door, and finally retrieving the fragrant, steaming loaves was a weekly drama with a delicious payoff. The smell of baking bread. Chapter 12. The Market Square as Social Hub. For a medieval woman living within the walls of a town or city, the weekly market was far more than a simple errand. It was the bustling, vibrant epicenter of her social world, a theater of commerce, conversation, and community where necessity and leisure were inextricably woven together. The market square transformed the chore of provisioning into a dynamic and engaging form of public life, offering a legitimate and essential reason to be out in the heart of the urban thrum. On market day, the square erupted into a cacophony of sensory experience. The air thickened with the mingled smells of fresh bread, ripe cheese, pungent fish, and the earthy scent of livestock penned at the edges. The cries of vendors hawking their wares, hot pies, fresh eels, rushes for your floor, created a constant, lively din. Stalls draped in colorful cloths displayed their goods. Bolts of Flemish wool, glinting metalware, exotic spices, and locally grown vegetables. For a woman, navigating this scene was an exercise in discernment and negotiation, but it was also her primary window onto the wider world. This was where news flowed as freely as ale. While inspecting the quality of thread or haggling over the price of a hen, a woman would exchange the vital gossip of the town. She would learn which merchant's ship was overdue, which apprentice had run afoul of his master, what scandal was brewing in the Guildhall, or what traveling preacher was due to speak. The market was the town's central nervous system, and women were its keen observers and primary transmitters of information. These exchanges were not idle chatter. They were a crucial means of maintaining social networks, assessing reputations, and staying informed about events that could affect her family's fortunes. The market also served as a grand stage for people watching and social performance. It was a place to see and be seen. A woman would wear H. Chapter 13. Pilgrimage, Journey and Fellowship. For the medieval woman, whose life was often circumscribed by the boundaries of her village, manor, or town walls, the pilgrimage represented an extraordinary rupture in the ordinary, a sacred journey that was also a grand, sanctioned adventure. More than just an act of profound piety, a pilgrimage offered a legitimate and transformative form of leisure, combining spiritual aspiration with the unparalleled freedoms of travel, camaraderie, and a temporary escape from the rigid hierarchies of daily life. The reasons for undertaking a pilgrimage were as varied as the pilgrims themselves. For some women, it was an act of thanksgiving or a plea for divine intercession. For a sick child, a husband at war, or personal salvation. For others, it was a penance prescribed by a confessor. But woven into these solemn purposes was the undeniable thrill of the journey itself. To secure her husband's permission, gather her savings for the journey, and don the simple, sturdy garments and broad-brimmed hat of a pilgrim was to step into a new, liberated identity. The pilgrim's staff and scrip, a small pouch, were her badges, granting her safe passage and the right to charity. The road was the true crucible of this unique leisure. On the well-trodden paths to Canterbury, Rome, or Compostela, social distinctions softened under the shared sun and dust. A noblewoman might find herself walking beside the wife of a candlemaker, united by blistered feet and a common destination. This fellowship of the road was a powerful social leveler. In the evenings, at crowded pilgrim hostels or hospices, stories were exchanged over simple meals. Tales of home, of miracles witnessed at other shrines, of dangers narrowly avoided. For women whose daily conversations were often limited to family and immediate neighbors, this was an education in the wide world. The pilgrimage also offered a rare, temporary suspension of domestic and marital duties. A woman on P. Chapter 14. Bathing, Gossip, and Social Baths. In the medieval imagination, often preoccupied with sin and mortification of the flesh, the simple act of bathing carried a surprising and complex social weight. While daily full immersion was rare, the practice of bathing, particularly in the communal bathhouses of towns, represented a significant, sanctioned space for women's leisure, hygiene, and intimate social bonding. Far from a purely private act, the bathhouse functioned as a unique, steamy sanctuary where the lines between cleansing, community, and candid conversation blurred. The public bathhouse, or stew, was a common feature in larger towns by the later Middle Ages. For a small fee, one could gain access to a wooden tub, hot water, and often a steam room. While these establishments had reputations that ranged from respectable to risque, for many women, visiting them in groups provided a legitimate and practical reason for a social outing. It was an extension of domestic work, the work of keeping the body clean, taken into a public yet segregated sphere. The social dynamic within the women's section of a bathhouse was profoundly different from any other space. Stripped of the layers of wool, linen, and societal markers like fine brooches or veils, women entered a state of relative equality. The physical barriers of clothing were literally shed, fostering an unusual intimacy. In the warm, humid air, surrounded by the sounds of splashing and the low echo of voices, conversation flowed with a distinctive freedom. The bathhouse was a notorious hub for gossip, but this gossip was more than idle talk. It was the vital exchange of the community's female intelligence. Here, in this relaxed and sequestered environment, women could speak with a candor impossible in the marketplace or at the church door. They might discuss marital troubles, childbirth experiences, or the behavior of local men with a bluntness softened by the therapeutic context. Recipes, remedies, and Chapter 15. The allure of romances and storytelling. Within the chamber, the convent, or by the flickering light of a hearth, one of the most potent and coveted forms of leisure for a medieval woman was the world of the romance. Whether absorbed from the illuminated pages of a precious manuscript or woven into the air by the voice of a storyteller, these tales of chivalry, enchantment, and courtly love offered a profound escape, a moral education, and a vibrant stimulus for the imagination. For women, especially those of the nobility and literate classes, romances were not mere entertainment. They were a gateway to parallel lives of higher feeling and grand adventure. For the fortunate few who could read, or who had a clerk or family member to read to them, the physical book was an object of beauty and wonder. Manuscripts like those of Chrétien de Troyes, recounting the deeds of Lancelot, Yvain, or Perceval, were richly illuminated. A lady could spend hours tracing the illustrations with her eyes, the knights in gleaming armor, the dragons, the enchanted forests, and the inevitably beautiful, often imperiled heroines. The act of reading or being read to was a leisurely, immersive experience. It demanded time and quiet attention, creating a private theater within the mind. The listener was transported from the stone confines of a castle to the mutable, magical landscape of Logres or the perilous wonder of the Grail Castle. The heroines of these romances provided complex mirrors. Women heard of figures like Guinevere, whose love was both celebrated and catastrophic, Enid, whose unwavering loyalty and courage saved her husband, or Iseult, the tragic queen bound by a fateful potion. These characters existed in a world where feminine beauty, wisdom, and emotional power could shape the destinies of empires and the fates of the greatest knights. While their lives were often circumscribed by love and duty, their inner worlds and influences were portrayed as vast and cons. Chapter 33. The Comfort of Pets and Companions. Amidst the grand social rituals and demanding labor of medieval life, one of the simplest and most personal sources of quiet joy for a woman was the companionship of animals. Beyond the livestock valued for their utility, there existed a cherished space for non-working creatures, pets who offered affection, amusement, and a unique, wordless solace. These small companions, from lapdogs to songbirds, provided a gentle, private form of leisure rooted in the uncomplicated bond between human and beast. The most iconic medieval pet was undoubtedly the small lapdog. In noble households, particularly breeds like the graceful greyhound in its smaller variants, or early forms of spaniels were favored. Manuscript illuminations frequently show elegant ladies with tiny, delicate dogs nestled in their laps or peeking from the sleeves of their gowns. These animals served as living symbols of their owners' refinement and leisure, creatures that required no practical purpose beyond companionship and beauty. The act of stroking a dog's silken ears, feeding it morsels from the table, or simply feeling its warm, breathing presence during long hours of sewing or contemplation was a profound sensory comfort. Their playful antics provided spontaneous, heart-lightening amusement. For women in more modest settings, a cat was a common and practical companion. While valued for keeping grain stores and kitchens free of vermin, cats also offered quiet fellowship. A cat curling by the hearth, purring on a lap, or engaging in a playful chase after a stray thread was a source of gentle distraction and warmth. Their independent yet affectionate nature made them ideal companions for women spending long hours alone in cottage or shop. Songbirds, particularly nightingales or finches kept in small cages, brought a different kind of pleasure. Their care was a delicate responsibility, but their reward was a private concert. In a sunlit chamber or a quiet. Chapter 34. The subversive fun of folk tales. Beyond the structured, courtly world of written romances lay a deeper, wilder, and more pervasive stream of entertainment. The folk tale. Passed down through generations in the firelit dark of cottages, at spinning bees, and in the hushed conversations of women's gatherings, these stories were a shared cultural treasure. For medieval women, especially those outside the literate aristocracy, folk tales were not just leisurely diversions. They were a subversive and vital source of wisdom, wish fulfillment, and psychological release, often carrying coded critiques of the very world in which their tellers lived. The tales were a genre where the ordinary rules of reality were suspended. Here, talking animals offered cunning advice, simple peasant girls outwitted kings, and wronged wives found magical helpers to rectify injustice. The protagonists were rarely armored knights. They were clever maidens, persecuted youngest sons, resourceful old women, and kind-hearted fools. For a female audience, these narratives were powerfully validating. They celebrated cunning over brute strength, patience over impulsive action, and compassion over arrogance, traits that were often a woman's primary means of navigating a patriarchal world. Consider the archetype of the wise old woman or the fairy godmother. Often living on the edge of the village or deep in the forest, she possessed secret knowledge of herbs, magic, and fate. She was a figure of immense latent power, independent of male authority, who could intervene to set things right. For the women listening, she represented a fantasy of female autonomy and potency, a counterpoint to their own legally and socially constrained lives. Similarly, tales where a young girl outsmarts a predatory wolf, a greedy giant, or a foolish king provided a narrative thrill of intelligence triumphing over superior physical or social power. The telling itself was a form of communal, participatory leisure. Chapter 35. Celebrating Saints' Days. The rhythm of the medieval year was marked not by calendars of paper, but by the living calendar of the Church. For women, the feast days of saints were far more than obligatory religious observances. They were eagerly anticipated breaks in routine, occasions for sanctioned festivity, communal pride, and a form of leisure that blended piety with very earthly pleasure. Each saint's day carried its own unique customs, foods, and social freedoms, creating a colorful mosaic of celebration throughout the year. Many of these celebrations were deeply local, centered on the patron saint of a parish church, a town, or a specific guild. On the eve of such a day, the atmosphere would shift. Women were at the heart of the preparations. They would clean the house with extra vigor, bake special saints' cakes, often shaped like the saint's attribute, keys for St. Peter, a sword for St. Paul, a gridiron for St. Lawrence, and prepare a feast that might feature a food associated with the saint. This preparatory work, while demanding, was charged with a sense of purpose and shared anticipation. The day itself often began with a special mass, where the community gathered in their best clothes. For women, this was a chance to see and be seen, to wear a favorite gown or a new veil. The church itself might be decorated with rushes and flowers gathered by the young women of the parish. The service was both a solemn duty and a social event, a gathering of the entire community in a shared identity. After Mass, the religious observance frequently gave way to secular revelry. There might be a fair in the churchyard or town square, with stalls selling ribbons, trinkets, and gingerbread. Games like foot races, archery contests, or wrestling matches were held, often with small prizes. Dancing around a maypole or in the street was common. For women, especially the young and unmarried, this was a prime opportunity for social mixing and courtship under the what? Chapter 36. The exchange of letters and tokens. For the literate medieval woman, particularly within the nobility and the growing merchant classes, a unique and deeply satisfying form of leisure existed in the private, intellectual realm of correspondence. The exchange of letters, often carried by trusted messengers over long distances, was more than a practical necessity. It was a cultivated art, a vehicle for friendship, patronage, political maneuvering, and romance. This slow, thoughtful communication provided a mental escape and a powerful sense of connection across the isolating miles. The act of writing itself was a leisurely ritual. It required privacy, quiet, and the careful assembly of tools. A quill, ink, a penknife for mending the nib, and precious paper or parchment. For a woman, this was a sanctioned space for focused, solitary thought. She could compose her mind as she composed her sentences, choosing her words with care, knowing they would be read and reread. The letters of women like Heloise to Abelard or those found in the Paton letters reveal worlds of emotion, shrewd observation, and administrative acumen. Writing to a distant friend, a relative at court, or a potential ally allowed her to maintain networks of influence and affection that were crucial to her family's and her own standing. Beyond the written word, the exchange of small, meaningful tokens deepened this connection. A letter might be accompanied by, or even serve as a wrapper for, a physical object charged with sentiment. A prayer bead or a seal ring pressed into wax carried the weight of identity and promise. A flower pressed between the pages, a lock of hair tied with a silk thread, or a hand-embroidered bookmark transformed a piece of correspondence into a multi-sensory experience. These tokens were tangible extensions of the sender's presence, to be held, viewed, and kept close. For lovers, they were the currency of courtly love. For friends, they were symbols of enduring bond. Chapter 37. The thrill of the hunt, from afar. While the noblewoman's direct participation in the chase was often limited to the refined art of hawking, the grand stag hunt remained a central spectacle of aristocratic life, a theater of danger, skill, and pageantry. For the women of the court, this event offered a distinct and thrilling form of leisure, not as active pursuers, but as privileged observers and celebrants. Their experience of the hunt was one of curated excitement, social ritual, and symbolic participation from the edges of the action. The day would begin with immense ceremony. The hunting party, led by the lord and his chief huntsman, would assemble in the castle yard. A vivid scene of prancing horses, baying hounds, and the glint of specialized weaponry like bows and hunting spears. Ladies would be in attendance, often mounted on fine palfreys, dressed in riding attire that blended practicality with elegance. Their role was not to follow the hounds into the thickest woods, but to accompany the party to a designated viewing point, often a hilltop or a cleared stand near a known animal run. From this vantage, the hunt unfolded before them like a living tapestry. They would listen as the professional huntsman used horns and cries to direct the limer dogs, which tracked the scent, and then the faster ratches, which pursued the quarry. The sound of the horn, different calls signaling questing, recasting, or the kill, provided an auditory narrative to the distant drama. The thrill was in the tension of the wait, the sudden surge of excitement when the stag was sighted breaking cover, and the heart-pounding distant view of the chase as horses and hounds streamed across the landscape below. This positioned observation was a socially approved way for women to experience the raw adrenaline of the hunt without transgressing the boundaries of feminine decorum. They could feel the collective excitement, share in the nervous laughter and gasps of the party. Chapter 38. The weaver's loom as social center. In the hum of the spinning bee, thread was born. But it was at the heavier, more substantial loom where that thread was transformed into cloth, the very fabric of medieval life. For women in towns and villages, particularly in regions with a strong textile trade, the loom was not just a piece of household equipment. It could become a focal point for female industry, skill, and surprisingly communal leisure. While weaving was hard, skilled labor, the shared space of a loom, especially the larger horizontal treadle loom that became common in later centuries, fostered a unique environment of collaboration and camaraderie. Weaving was often a household enterprise, with women playing central roles. In peasant homes, a smaller vertical loom might be used to produce the family's coarse linens and wools. The work was solitary and demanding, but in artisan households in textile towns, the dynamic could shift. A master weaver might be male, but his wife, daughters, and female servants were frequently integral to the process, winding bobbins, preparing the warp threads on the loom's frame, and assisting with the intricate work of setting up patterns. In some widowed or independent contexts, women operated their own looms as weaveresses, managing a small trade. It was during the long, rhythmic process of weaving a substantial piece that the social potential emerged. The loom's operation required a steady, repetitive motion, pressing the treadles to shift the warp threads, throwing the shuttle carrying the weft through the shed, and beating the new thread into place with the reed. This rhythm, like that of spinning, allowed for conversation. If the loom was in a central workshop or a large household room, other women might gather nearby to help with preparatory tasks or their own sewing, creating a de facto workshop collective. Here, the leisure was in the shared mastery of a complex craft and the satisfaction of visible creation. Chapter 39. Feasting and its social theater. For the medieval noblewoman, the feast was the ultimate stage. Far more than a mere meal, it was a meticulously orchestrated piece of social theater, a multisensory spectacle where her role was both audience and performer. Her leisure during these events was an active, complex engagement with display, diplomacy, and the subtle arts of hospitality and influence. Long before the first course, her leisure began in the strategic preparations. She would consult with the steward and the master cook on the menu, ensuring the dishes reflected her family's wealth and taste. She would oversee the decoration of the hall with tapestries and fresh rushes strewn with herbs. Most critically, she would plan the seating arrangement at the high table, a delicate political puzzle where placing a rival too close to the host or a potential ally too far away could send powerful messages. This logistical artistry was a satisfying exercise in social power. As guests arrived, her performance began. Dressed in her most sumptuous gown and finest jewels, she presided over the gathering with her lord husband. Her demeanor, gracious, poised, attentive, was a direct reflection of the household's honor. The feast followed a strict, ceremonial sequence, the serving of each course a ritual in itself. Her leisure lay in observing this living tapestry, noting the alliances formed over shared dishes, the flirtations simmering between younger guests, the deference shown by lesser nobles. The food itself was a form of curated entertainment. Exotic dishes like peacock redressed in its own feathers, intricate subtleties made of sugar and marzipan shaped like castles or allegorical scenes, and spiced wines were as much for spectacle as sustenance. A skilled hostess ensured these marvels were presented with flair, provoking admiration and conversation. Her role was to guide this conversation, to draw out shy guests, to tactfully mediate heated debates, and to ends. Chapter 40. The privacy of the bower. Amidst the public spectacle of the feast and the communal labor of the workshop, the medieval noblewoman possessed a crucial, cherished sanctuary, the bower. This was more than a bedroom. It was a private suite of rooms, a sitting room, a bedchamber, perhaps a small adjoining chapel or study, that served as her personal domain. Within these walls, a different, more intimate form of leisure flourished, one defined by privacy, retreat, and the pursuit of quieter, personal pleasures. The bower was a physical manifestation of a woman's separate sphere. Here, the public performance of the lady of the manor could be set aside. She could shed the heavy, formal layers of her public gown for a lighter kirtle or robe, loosen her hair from its restrictive veils and wimples, and simply exist as herself, away from the eyes of the court, the household, and often her lord husband. This alone was a profound luxury. This privacy enabled leisure activities of a more solitary or confidential nature. It was here that she would keep her most prized possessions: her book of hours, which she could read and contemplate in silence; her jewelry casket; her personal correspondence; and perhaps a small, exquisite embroidery frame for a private project, distinct from the household needlework. The bower was the setting for the intimate socializing of the embroidery circle or the sewing circle, where trusted female companions, her ladies-in-waiting, her daughters, a close friend, could gather to work and converse in a space free from male intrusion. The bower was also the heart of her managerial power in a more personal vein. Here, she might interview a prospective servant for the nursery, hear petitions from tenants' wives, or consult with her stewardess on the finer points of household accounts. This was business conducted without an audience, where her authority was direct and unmediated. For a mother, the bower was the nursery's annex. Young Children B. Chapter 41. The Unrecorded Laughter. History, with its ledgers, legal codes, and chronicles of great events, is notoriously silent on the sound of laughter. Yet, for the medieval woman, some of the most genuine and liberating leisure must have existed in those moments that left no trace. The unrecorded laughter shared in a sun-drenched kitchen garden, the helpless giggles during a botched sewing attempt, the roaring mirth over a shared joke in the alehouse that was never deemed fit for a manuscript's margin. This chapter is an acknowledgement of that invisible architecture of joy, the spontaneous fun that was the true mortar of daily life. Consider the universal human experience of shared absurdity. A group of women washing clothes at the riverbank when a sudden gust of wind sends a shift billowing into the water like a wayward ghost. The exasperated sigh, then the inevitable, breathless laughter. A young novice in a convent, trying to solemnly process with a censer, accidentally tapping the head of the sister in front of her, sparking a chain of suppressed, shaking giggles that threatens the solemnity of the office. These were moments of pure, unscripted reaction, breaks in the performance of duty where sheer silliness reigned. There was laughter in mimicry and storytelling. Around a hearth, a woman gifted with mimicry might impersonate the pompous gait of the parish priest, the shrill complaints of a difficult neighbor, or the drunken boasts of the village bailiff. These performances, never written down, were a potent and safe form of social commentary and release. The laughter they provoked was one of recognition and catharsis, a way of collectively deflating the powerful and navigating the frustrations of communal life through humor. There was the private, tender laughter of family intimacy. A mother laughing at her toddler's first attempt to say a complicated word. Sisters dissolving into laughter while trying, and failing, to arrange each other's hair in a pause. Chapter 43. Healing Arts as Intellectual Pursuit. For many medieval women, particularly in rural areas and within the manor household, the practice of healing was an essential duty, a blend of inherited wisdom, herbal lore, and compassionate care. Yet, for some, especially literate noblewomen or those within monastic communities, this duty transcended mere tradition and became a profound intellectual pursuit, a deeply satisfying form of leisure that engaged the mind, the senses, and the spirit. Their stillroom or herb garden was their laboratory, and their handwritten receptaria, recipe books, were their manuscripts of experiment and theory. This intellectual leisure began with study. Women with access to books might consult texts like the Trotula, a compendium on women's medicine, herbals describing plants and their virtues, or translated works of classical authorities like Dioscorides or Galen. A noblewoman's book of hours might have margins filled with personal notes on remedies. This wasn't passive reading. It was cross-referencing, questioning, and comparing written authority with observed reality. Could the classical description of a plant's power be verified in her own garden? Did the monastic recipe for a salve work better with honey or with egg white as a base? The heart of the pursuit was in the experimental practice. The distillation of waters and spirits using an alembic, the careful compounding of ointments in a mortar, the precise timing of harvesting flowers at their most potent, all required meticulous attention and a methodical mind. A woman might spend a quiet afternoon in her stillroom, a small, private chamber often adjacent to her garden, testing the clarity of a rosewater distillation or grinding spices for a theriac, a universal antidote. This was leisure as focused, tangible creation, with the added nobility of purpose, the alleviation of suffering. The management of the herb garden itself was a scientific endeavor. It required knowledge of Chapter 42. May Day and its Liberties. Of all the festive hinges of the medieval year, May Day stood apart. It was a celebration not of saints or harvest, but of life itself, of fertility, renewal, and the raw, greening power of spring. For women, particularly the young and unmarried, May Day represented a unique and potent suspension of the normal social order. It was a day of sanctioned liberties, where their roles were not merely participatory but central, and where the rules of everyday conduct were softened by the old magic of the season. The festivities began at dawn. It was the custom for young people, especially the maidens of the village or town, to rise before sunrise and go a-maying. They would venture into the woods and fields to gather flowers, green boughs, and particularly hawthorn, May blossom, to decorate their homes, the church, and most importantly, the maypole. This early morning expedition was itself a thrill, a temporary escape from parental oversight into the dewy, half-lit world, often in the company of young men. The act of gathering was playful and charged with a sense of purpose. They were collecting the very essence of spring to bring back to the community. The centerpiece was the maypole, a tall, stripped tree trunk painted in bright stripes and crowned with a floral garland. Raising it was a communal effort, but the dances that followed were dominated by women and girls. Weaving long, colored ribbons in intricate patterns as they danced in a circle, they were the living engine of the celebration. To be chosen as the May Queen, the girl crowned with the most elaborate floral wreath, often selected for her beauty and popularity, was the highest honor of the day. For that day, she was the personification of spring, presiding over the games and dances with a playful authority. This was a day when the usual hierarchies of gender and class bent. Social inversion was a key theme. A humble milkmaid, as May Queen, might be playfully treated with. Chapter 44. The Ritual of the Bedding Ceremony. At the stark opposite end of the private leisure of the bower lay a moment of intensely public, communal, and often raucous fun that directly centered on a woman's body and social transition. The bedding ceremony. This ritual, following a wedding feast, marked the culmination of the marriage contract in the most physical sense. For the new bride, it was a moment of profound vulnerability, but for the wedding guests, especially the women, it was a sanctioned, festive, and deeply traditional form of participatory leisure that blended celebration, scrutiny, and social reinforcement. The ceremony began as the feast drew to a close. The bride and groom would be ceremoniously led from the hall to the bridal chamber, often to the sound of music, jokes, and rowdy cheers. The procession was typically led by the most important female relatives and guests. This was not a private escort. A substantial portion of the wedding party of both sexes would crowd into the chamber. The ritual that followed was one of symbolic preparation and very public witness. The women had a specific and active role. They would undress the bride, or at least remove her outer garments and jewels, and prepare her for bed. This was often done with much laughter, teasing, and advice of a bluntly practical nature. Ancient fertility charms might be performed, tying a stocking around the bedpost, scattering herbs like lavender or sage on the sheets, or reciting old rhymes. The groom, meanwhile, was being prepared by the men in a similarly boisterous fashion, often in a separate room or on the other side of a curtain. The moment of putting the couple to bed together was the climax. The pair would be tucked in, often with a priest blessing the bed. In some traditions, the guests would then retreat only as far as the hallway or an adjoining room. Drinking and making noise to ensure the couple's privacy was anything but. The proof of consummation, often the S. Chapter 45. Leisure as a quiet act of resilience. Having journeyed from the clamor of the market square to the silence of the scriptorium, from the whirling dance of May Day to the intimate laughter by the hearth, we arrive at a final, unifying truth about medieval women's fun. It was, in its essence, a quiet act of resilience. Each moment of leisure, whether stolen or sanctioned, was a small but deliberate assertion of selfhood in a world that often sought to define them solely by duty and relation to others. Their amusement was the proof of a spirit that could not be fully contained by law, liturgy, or loom. Consider the sheer ingenuity required to carve out these spaces. Leisure was rarely handed to them. It was woven into the fabric of obligation. The spinning bee transformed solitary toil into a symposium. The herb garden turned daily healing into a science of the senses. The pilgrimage sanctified a thirst for travel and fellowship. In each case, they took what was necessary and made it meaningful, finding the fun hidden within the function. This ingenuity itself was a subtle rebellion, a demonstration that their minds and hearts were their own. Their leisure also served as a vital psychological buffer. The unrecorded laughter after a minor disaster in the dairy, the shared eye roll during a tedious sermon, the private pleasure of a well-stitched seam, these were pressure valves. They released the tensions built up by a life of constrained choices and constant labor. The courtly love tradition, for all its artificiality, allowed noble women to experience adoration as individuals. The folk tales of clever maidens and powerful crones provided narrative armor against a world where power was so often held by others. This psychological self-preservation was a non-negotiable form of maintenance, and its tools were often playful. Furthermore, their fun built and sustained female-centric communities. The trust forged in the bathhouse, the knowledge exchanged over the. Chapter 46. The Spindle's Legacy. We end not with a grand summation, but with a simple, enduring object. The spindle. It is the perfect emblem of all we have traced. In its humble, whirling form, it contains the entire paradox of medieval women's leisure. It was, first and always, an instrument of relentless work. Yet, as we have seen, it became the centerpiece of the spinning bee, transforming solitude into society and monotony into conversation. The spindle's purpose was to make thread, the fundamental unit of all fabric. And so it was with their fun. Each moment of leisure, the shared secret, the gambled coin, the sung ballad, the nurtured herb, was a single sturdy thread they spun. Alone, a thread is weak, but woven together, these threads created a fabric of astounding resilience. The tapestry of their leisure was what lined the interior of their lives. It provided warmth against the chill of hardship, beauty amidst stark necessity, and a pattern of meaning unique to their experience. This fabric was rarely displayed for official history. It was the inner lining, unseen but essential, that gave shape and comfort to the outer garment of their prescribed roles. The spindle's legacy, therefore, is not recorded in charters or chronicles. It is found in the continuity of the very things they cherished. It is in the folktale still told, the herbal remedy still used, the melody of a lullaby that survived centuries. It is in the understanding that community is forged as much in gossip as in law, and that power resides not only in the sword, but in the careful stitch, the well-timed story, and the shared laugh that breaks attention. To ask what medieval women did for fun is to finally see them not as figures in a landscape, but as the weavers of that landscape's hidden textures. They spun their threads from the raw materials of their existence: duty, knowledge, faith, and friendship, and from them, they wove a world within a world of their own making, a whirl. Chapter 47. Echoes in the Stone. The laughter has faded. The last stitch of the tapestry is secured. The final ember of the hearth has cooled. We are left with the silent architecture they inhabited. The castle, the cottage, the cloister, the market square. But if you listen closely to these stones, you can still hear the echoes of their leisure, etched not in grand inscriptions, but in the wear patterns of the world they shaped. Walk through the ruins of a nunnery cloister. The smooth groove worn into a stone bench by generations of sisters sitting in the sun during recreation, their quiet talk of scripture and sisterhood carried off by the wind. The shallow dip in the sill of a scriptorium window, where a nun rested her arm as she paused from illuminating a psalm to gaze at her herb garden below, finding inspiration in the lavender and the sage. Stand in the great hall of a castle. Look not at the dais, but at the fireplace hood. Imagine the shadows dancing as women listen to a romance, their faces flickering with reflected wonder. See the worn step of the spiral staircase leading to the solar, trodden by countless feet carrying sewing baskets, sleepy children, and whispered secrets up to the privacy of the bower. Visit a village church. See not just the altar but the porch. That was where women gathered after Mass, the news of the week exchanged as essential as any prayer. Notice the faint, playful scratchings on a back pew, not vandalism, but the idle doodles of a young girl during a long sermon, a tiny testament to a wandering mind seeking its own amusement. In the market square, the cobblestones are worn smooth by a millennium of footsteps. Among them, the slightly deeper prints where the stalls of the cloth sellers and the spicers once stood, the places women lingered longest, where commerce bled into communion. Even the landscape holds the memory. That ancient hawthorn at the edge of the field is not just a tree. It is a likely remnant of the May Day W. Chapter 48. A thread for your hand. Our exploration has drawn to a close. We have wandered from sun-drenched gardens to the shadowed corners of taverns, from the solemn choir of the convent to the raucous ring of the May Day dance. We have sought the medieval woman not in the writs of law or the chronicles of war, but in the spaces between, where her spirit breathed, her mind engaged, and her joy, however quiet or constrained, insisted upon its existence. The portrait that emerges is not one of passive endurance, but of active creation. She was an alchemist of daily life, transmuting the lead of duty into moments of golden leisure. The spindle in her hands was more than a tool. It was a metaphor. With it, she spun the raw, rough flax of her existence. The unending labor, the social restrictions, the physical trials, into something strong, useful, and beautiful. She spun thread, yes, but she also spun community at the bee, spun strategy at the chessboard, spun stories by the hearth, and spun a sense of self within the sanctuary of her own mind. Her legacy is not found in a list of pastimes, but in a blueprint for resilience. She demonstrates that the human need for pleasure, for connection, and for intellectual and creative expression is irrepressible. It will find a crevice in the most rigid social structure and put down roots. Her fun was her fortress. The laughter shared over a brewing vat was a wall against despair. The knowledge contained in her herb garden was a moat against helplessness. The intricate pattern of her embroidery was a standard declaring her presence and skill. To study her leisure is to fundamentally reevaluate her world, and by extension, our own historical imagination. It asks us to listen for the murmur in the manorial record, to see the agency in the acceptance of a courtship token, to recognize the intellectual rigor in the management of a stillroom. It restores dimension to figures too often flattened by time into archetypes of peasant. Chapter 49. The Unfinished Tapestry. We have reached the final panel of the tapestry we have been examining. But a crucial truth remains. The work itself was never finished. The leisure of medieval women was not a static picture, captured and complete. It was a living practice, evolving with each generation, adapting to new laws, new fashions, new fears, and new faiths. To declare our study concluded is not to say their story ended. It is to acknowledge that we have observed but a section of an endless weave. Consider the threads we have followed. The spinning bee of the 12th century village looks, in its essence of communal labor, similar to the one in the 15th century. But the talk within that circle changed. The Black Death entered the conversation, emptying villages and altering economic realities. Heresy trials might have hushed certain debates. The rise of vernacular literature meant some women might now bring a fragment of a printed romance to ponder, shifting the oral tradition. The pattern adapted, incorporating new colors of experience. The pilgrimage route remained, but the world around it transformed. The growth of towns, the crises of the papacy, the reports from crusader states, all filtered into the stories told on the road. A merchant's wife in 1400 had access to different luxuries, different news, and a different urban landscape for her social leisure than her counterpart in 1200. Her fun was shaped by the rising economic power of her class. Even the most intimate spaces were not immune. The devotional reading of an early medieval noblewoman, focused on a stark and glorious illuminated psalter, differs from the more personal, emotional piety encouraged by later mystical texts. The leisure of her prayer was subtly redirected by theological currents. This unfinished quality is the most hopeful testament to their spirit. Proves their leisure was not a relic, but a response. It was a dialogue with their changing world. When one avenue closed, Perha. Chapter 50. The Quiet Triumph. We have come to the end of our numbered chapters, yet the story refuses a final sum. For the triumph of the medieval woman's leisure was not in its spectacle, but in its quiet persistence. It was a victory measured not in territory claimed or wealth amassed, but in integrity preserved. In the steadfast refusal to allow the spirit to be fully quantified by duty, or the heart to be entirely governed by decree. History, in its grand accounting, tallies the visible. Battles, laws, buildings, treaties. It is ill-equipped to audit the intangible treasury of a shared joke that lightened a heavy heart, the courage found in a song sung together, the peace of a private thought in a sunlit garden. These were the currencies of her inner kingdom, and she was its diligent, creative sovereign. Her leisure was the proof of that sovereignty. Do not mistake this for a small thing. In a world that sought to define her by relationship, daughter, wife, widow, nun, her moments of chosen amusement were declarations of selfhood. When she placed a bet on a dice roll, she was, for a heartbeat, an individual governed by fortune alone. When she argued a point of strategy over a chessboard, she was a mind, ungendered, engaged in pure logic. When she lost herself in the rhythm of a dance, she was a body celebrating its own vitality, not a vessel for future lineage. This quiet triumph echoes. It is the reason her world does not feel entirely alien to us. We recognize the human in her choices. We understand the need to turn work into community, to find beauty in utility, to seek laughter as relief. The contexts are strange, the smells, the sounds, the stark limitations, but the impulses are familiar. This kinship across centuries is her ultimate, unspoken legacy. It tells us that the texture of a life, its real substance, is often woven in these undervalued hours. The history of power is a history of noise. The history of leisure is a history of hums.